everybody. I want to especially say thank you to the group, the committee, the group that has been meeting with us this last couple of days. To Monica, I'm sorry, I only know the first names. To Monica, Peter, Andre, and I'm leaving somebody out. And the rector. Thank you very much. I'm sure you would much prefer to have Alvin Plantinga standing here before you today. Unfortunately, he's not able to be here. I'm sure that as you look up at me, there's no question that this is not Alvin Plantinga standing before you, even though this is an occasion to celebrate him and his life's work. I'm Jane Plantinga Pauw, Alvin's oldest daughter and second child. My father would have loved to be standing before you today, but he's no longer traveling. He's no longer teaching, he's no longer writing, and he has asked me to stand in for him today. He wants to send you words of deepest thanks for your efforts to honor him today. As your brother in Christ and as your partner in philosophical work, he wishes to send you his warmest greetings, and he states his sincere apologies for not being able to meet with you in person. As the daughter of Alvin Plantinga, my life has been richly blessed. Being a part of his family has opened up countless interesting experiences as I tagged along with him during some of his many life's adventures. While I was growing up, our home base was at Calvin College in Grand Rapids, Michigan, where he taught at Calvin College. About every third or fourth year, we left Grand Rapids for a year at a time and traveled to places like Palo Alto, California, where he was a visiting professor at Stanford, Los Angeles, where he taught at UCLA, and Oxford, where he taught at Balliol College, Oxford University. Each time we did this, we children got to live in a different state or country and make new friends and experience a different culture. The summer after our year at Oxford, my parents bought an old Volkswagen camper van, and we traveled around in Western Europe for the summer, for much of the summer. We camped in fields and in parks each night, and we went to a restaurant only once because of being on a young professor's salary. We just didn't have the money. And we had a magnificent time. We later were able to attend the Gifford Lectures in St. Andrews, Scotland. And then in 2017, the whole extended Plantinga clan, which is huge, got to travel to Chicago to be present for the awarding of the Templeton Prize. A grand experience indeed. Last year, we were invited to the awarding of the Templeton Prize again in Washington, D.C., and we got to meet the year's recipient, who was the King of Jordan, King Abdullah. And now today, I am truly blessed to meet you all and privileged to be in your presence, representing my father for this august occasion. When I recently expressed to my parents what a privilege this has been for me to travel around with him throughout the world, throughout his career, my mother said, and I was really lucky, I got to go and experience this and much more. And then my dad said, if you think you're lucky, you ought to be me. My reflections today will center on Alvin Plantinga, the person, more than Alvin Plantinga, the professor of philosophy, because that's how I know him best, as a person and as a father. Not many have this opportunity to hear about him from this perspective, because he doesn't like to talk about himself. and he doesn't talk about his accomplishments. He simply loves to think philosophically and deeply, and his life's work flows from that. But it is also from his rich spiritual life that his thinking flows. When he was asked by Kelly Clark to write his spiritual autobiography, his first impulse was to decline. As he put it, that was also my second impulse and my third. He didn't consider his spiritual story to be particularly interesting, and certainly not outstanding. Leading up to this autobiography he eventually conceded to writing, he shares all kinds of reasons why he hesitated. First among them, this: it's hard and perhaps not helpful to be completely honest about one's life before God. All of us have motives that are tinged with self-deception, with a need to present ourselves as less fallible than we actually are. And if we do venture into the areas of our lives that are broken and fallible, we risk hurting the people we've offended and let down. And to top it off, he said, his own spiritual life has only been partly lived. It is, as he put it, a life that hasn't progressed nearly as much as, by my age and given my opportunities, it should have. My dad's humility seems to come from a very genuine place. It seems to be a deep part of his spirituality. Humility in the academic world, particularly for a person who has excelled, does not come easily. I remember in my college days at Calvin College discussing this with my dad. The group of young Calvin College friends that I was associating with had a decidedly arrogant bent, leaning toward intellectual elitism. And this bothered me. When I talked to my dad, he told me stories of his own encounters with this kind of sneering attitude in his younger days. Over the span of his career, he must have fought this tendency often. In the end, the fruit of his journey could be seen at every lecture or workshop he gave, when at the end of the lecture, there would come the question and answer period, and questions would come in from all over the universe, all good questions and bad questions. And instead of disregarding or denigrating ill-formed or uninformed questions, he would try his best to understand where the questioner was coming from, to restate the question, and then to answer it the best he could. These question and answer periods were, for me as a little child watching them, by far the most interesting part of every lecture that I attended. Sometimes the questions would be hostile. It seemed that the questioner wanted to trap my dad, or to prove him wrong. I remember always being absolutely sure that my dad would win any argument, and I swelled with pride every time he did. It seemed to me that nobody in the whole world could ever out-argue my dad. But the answers that he gave were never biting or designed to humiliate. They were, it seemed to me, always from a place of searching for the truth, not for winning an argument. In his undergraduate years at Jamestown College and Calvin College and Harvard University and then Calvin College again, the seeds of his philosophical career were sown. At Harvard, he encountered serious and articulate non-Christian thought for the first time. and he struggled with doubt at this time. He encountered objections to Christianity that were strong and compelling. But his doubts were always accompanied by a kind of bravado, as he called it. That strong inner voice that did not give in easily to objections to Christianity, but questioned the objections, challenged them, and determined to push and prod them. What precisely is the substance of their objections to Christianity or to theism? Do these objections really have much by way of substance? And if, as he strongly suspected, not, why should they be taking the views? Why should they taking the views they did be relevant to what I thought? After a short time at Harvard, he transferred back to Calvin so that he could study under his most highly regarded professor, Harry Jellema. He reveled in Jellema's thinking regarding the philosophical opposition to theism that he had encountered at Harvard. Jellema thought that much of this opposition was, in reality, a sort of intellectual imperialism with really little real basis. And this seemed right to my dad. My dad spent much of his career fleshing this out, that this indeed was the truth. In God and Other Minds, he argued that belief in God is equally rational as belief in other minds. In God, Freedom, and Evil, he directed his attention to what he considers the most deeply baffling and disturbing objection to theism, the existence of evil, especially horrifying cruelty. He argues that even an omnipotent God would not create beings who lacked freedom and therefore the ability to choose to do what was wrong. But even so, he maintains that the appalling nature of some kinds of evil, as well as the personal toll evil can take on individuals and whole groups of people, are beyond the reach of the free will defense and call for pastoral care and counseling. In 1966, as he was hard at work, Time magazine, do you all know Time magazine? Yeah. Time magazine published its well-known cover story, Is God Dead? By 1980, however, as William Joyno put it, the somewhat chastened Time magazine acknowledged that God was not. God is making a comeback. Most intriguingly, this is happening not among theologians or ordinary believers, most of whom never accepted for a moment that he was in any serious trouble, but in the crisp intellectual circles of academic philosophers, where the consensus had long banished the Almighty from fruitful discourse. The man Time credited more than any other for this turnabout was America's leading Orthodox Protestant professor of philosophy, Alvin Plantinga. The trilogy that many consider his most masterful work, Warranted Christian Belief, he tackles the rationality of Christian belief, concluding that Christian belief is a properly basic belief, not drawn inferentially from anything else, and is therefore properly a foundational belief. In his later work, he turned his attention to another purported academic conflict between religion and science. In his book, Where the Conflict Really Lies, he outlines his argument that while there is superficial conflict but deep concord between science and theistic religion, there is superficial concord but deep conflict between naturalism and unguided evolution. In a return to his initial instincts as a graduate student at Harvard in response to the serious non-Christian thought he encountered, he considered the rise of the new atheists like Daniel Dennett, Richard Dawkins, the late Christopher Hitchens, and Sam Harris, and he answered some of their questions in his works, playfully calling them the four horsemen of the atheist apocalypse. In Knowledge and Christian Belief, he mercilessly lays bare their inadequacies in this quintessential quote. One might say that they are more style than substance, except that there isn't much by way of style either. Their preferred style seems to be less that of serious scholarly work than of pamphleteering and furious denunciation. They blame everything short of bad weather and tooth decay on religion. Their style emphasizes venom, vitriol, vituperation, ridicule, insult, and naked contempt. What's missing, however, is cogent argument. Once again, nobody can out-argue my dad. Bravado alongside the humility is perhaps one of the most intriguing combinations of characteristics to observe in my dad. The bravado seen in his fearless answers to modern philosophical challenges has bolstered serious academic Christian philosophy and ensured that it can maintain its strong voice at the philosophical table. But it's the humility, combined with a kind of modest, down-to-earthness that eschews showiness, that has made my dad so pleasant and fun to associate with. No snuffy academic, he was the first in his college. Oh, thank you. He was the first in his college to introduce hiking boots as acceptable footwear to wear for professors and students in college. I don't think that trend has made it over here yet. Maybe later. Not today anyway. Maybe other days. Yeah. The old cars our family bought and then drove until they died. The short naps he took every afternoon before dinner, lying on the family room floor, sometimes while we kids put curlers in his hair. The joking and laughing that always accompanied our family dinners and gatherings, all of these and many other traits ensured that philosophy, while important, is not the be-all and end-all of his life. His family and his love of mountains both vied with philosophy for first place in his life. Volumes could be written about each, but just a few comments will have to suffice. At Calvin College, my dad met and fell in love with Kathleen de Boer, and they married just after graduation. The behind-the-scenes contribution of my mother to my father's success is huge, of course, as you can imagine. With all the moving every 3 or 4 years from city to city back to Grand Rapids, all of the packing and preparing and cleaning the house for rental was an incredibly strenuous proposition, and it primarily fell on my mother's shoulders. The day-to-day operation in the home and the 4 children, too, fell primarily to my mom, though my dad really enjoyed us and helped out when he could. He woke us up early each morning and cooked us a hot breakfast, usually oatmeal or eggs, and he cleaned up the kitchen every day after dinner. But the non-stop entertaining, the cooking, and the feeding of graduate students and visiting philosophers fell squarely on my mother's shoulders. Their house was set up to accommodate huge groups of people, and they often filled the house with people. And it was her support and hard work in the background that allowed my father to shine in the foreground. Yet another blessing came in the package with my mother, an introduction to the mountains in the western United States. Coming from Lyndon, Washington, in the nation's mountainous northwest corner, my mom's family introduced my dad to the joys of hiking and mountain climbing. A whole volume could be written on his love affair with mountains and his experiences climbing and teaching climbing to Calvin students. He taught philosophy, he also taught mountain climbing and rock climbing, cliff climbing. The sensus divinitatis seemed to work most strongly for him in the mountains. His obsession with the mountains brought our whole family out west each summer, a car trip of more than 3,200 kilometers each way every summer, so that he could climb mountains while we camped or visited with extended family. In the end, he had climbed many of the United States' highest and most dramatic mountains, along with some in Europe, including the Matterhorn. Finally, I must mention one more area of interest in my father's life, which has particularly influenced me and my siblings: his early commitment to social justice. The 1960s was a momentous decade in the United States as we struggled to come to terms with the huge racial divide in our country, perpetuated by the unhealed wounds of chattel slavery. Grand Rapids was a divided town, divided between the races, and a white part of town and a black part of town. My family had us live in the black part of town, along with other Calvin College families. And they took intentional measures to contribute to efforts for racial reconciliation. We lived in a section of town that was not primarily white, and we went to a Christian school that held inner city social justice as one of its core values. My father had earlier participated in one of the freedom marches with Martin Luther King, and the story of this very march that he was in is captured in a movie, a 2014 movie called Selma, which some of you have seen. A march in which one of my dad's associates was clubbed to death by a white separatist. Then in 1968, in the wake of Martin Luther King's assassination, my dad and my brother marched in Grand Rapids to show outrage and continued solidarity with the civil rights movement. Being too little to march, I had to stand in the crowd, but I wished I could have marched with them. Finally, while my father's influence may have been most pronounced and well-known in his philosophical work and in the world's intellectual landscape, his life revolves around so much more. As we honor him today, we celebrate his work and the changes it brought to the Academy, along with the spiritual influence he has. And while we do so, we thank God for his faith, which gives birth both to his bravado and to his humility. Thank you, university colleagues, for lifting up his contributions today.